Well met, adventurer. How much volume should you be doing in the gym? How do you know if you're doing enough or even too much? That's the topic for today's quest, at the end of which you will have some very practical guidelines that you can apply to your own training, as well as probably some piece of gear that's going to be utterly useless to you because quest drops are always trash compared to raid drops and crafted gear. I'm Rance, this is Muscle and Magicka, and you, my friend, just accepted a quest. Today's question comes from DKB003 on Instagram, which I'm fairly confident stands for Death Knight Baron III. And this makes me slightly uncomfortable, if I'm honest, answering questions for a Death Knight Baron. However, everyone knows the traditional way to counter a Death Knight is with a Paladin, so I think I'll recruit the help of my friend, my associate, my main, my Paladin Lahatiel. Try not to be too distracted by his devilish good looks, or mine, for that matter. Now, when we talk about volume, it's important to distinguish exactly what we mean in terms of volume versus some of the other variables. Hey, guys, right here. As I was saying, volume, typically discussed as load times sets times reps, or in other words, the total work performed within a given period of time. Now, we know that strength has three main components: neurological adaptation, which means motor units getting better at recruiting muscle fibers, etc., morphological adaptation, or in other words, hypertrophy, and skill acquisition, which is basically your technical ability to perform the movement that you're trying to get stronger at. And this is where volume becomes important for strength, because more volume doesn't just mean more work performed, but actually more practice towards acquiring that skill. Hypertrophy, on the other hand, is much less related to neurological adaptation and skill acquisition and is primarily a function of volume. Now, we know that both strength and hypertrophy have a linear relationship with volume. For instance, we have plenty of studies showing us that multiple sets are better than just one set in terms of both strength and muscle gain. And we also know that in the long term, over the course of your training age, volume will need to go up as you progress from beginner to intermediate to advanced. Now, since we know that volume is good, and since we know that Lahatiel is remarkably good looking, doesn't it just make sense that he should constantly do the maximum amount of volume possible? Not necessarily, and here's why. If we take a look at the two-factor model of fitness and fatigue, I think you'll see that actually... Guys, I'm gonna need you to try here, okay? Can we focus? As I was saying, the reason that more volume isn't necessarily always better can be demonstrated by the two-factor model of fitness and fatigue. As we develop fitness, we simultaneously develop fatigue, which in turn masks the fitness. Think about it. Let's say Lahatiel enters a challenging fight, which, I mean, let's face it, is highly unlikely, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that he actually breaks a sweat, okay? If, as soon as the fight were over, he were to immediately be teleported into another fight, equal in difficulty to the first, even though he hasn't lost any of his gains, he would still be significantly less capable of completing it. It would appear as if he were less fit, when in reality that's just fatigue masking his fitness in the form of lower health, less mana, blown cooldowns, and so on and so forth. Now in this instance, Lahatiel would just bubble and he'd be fine because he's a paladin. But see, you're not going to have a bubble in the gym. That's why it's imperative that you find ways to manage your fatigue. And one of the ways you do this is by making sure that the amount of volume that you perform is sufficient, but not extraneous. What we found is that while more volume is better to a point, past that point, both strength and hypertrophy actually begin to plateau and even decline if you push it too far. We call this the concept of diminishing returns. For example, I know that haste is good on my red paladin, but I also know that the benefit starts to cap off right around 30% when the cooldown on my judgment is low enough that I can have it active pretty much constantly. Now, if I continue to raise my haste past that point, I may still glean some benefit, but not as much as if I were to gear into crit or mastery instead. In the same way, doing more volume than you can effectively recover from may very well lead to continued increases in fitness. The problem is that eventually fatigue, instead of dissipating back down to normal like it's supposed to, will actually start to exponentially outpace fitness, becoming unmanageable and ultimately resulting in decreased fitness when you have to take an entire month off of training to wait for it to normalize because you were more stubborn and bullheaded than a Tauren. And even Tauren know how important it is to recover from their training. Keep in mind also that fatigue is not just something that we generate metabolically as a consequence of lifting, but also mentally and even outside the gym from a variety of factors in our daily lives, which is another good reason to leave a little bit of extra reserve in the tank rather than maxing out volume and just going balls to the wall because we can. In essence, we want to do enough volume to progress until it becomes necessary to do more volume to progress. And a good rule of thumb to help you determine whether or not the amount you're doing is appropriate is to ask yourself the following series of questions. First of all, am I even stalled to begin with? Because if it ain't broke, you can pretty much guarantee it's going to be nerfed in the next patch. If I am stalled, am I recovered? If so, go ahead and increase volume. If not, try reducing volume temporarily. If that works, great. If you stall again very, very quickly, that's a good sign that you might be doing too much volume and it's time to consider reducing it and probably re-rolling Paladin also if you haven't done so already. Guys, we are like this close to the end. If you can just please. If you're entirely unsure where to start, I'm going to give you some very loose guidelines from which you can begin and then adjust based on your response. Aim to achieve somewhere in the range of 40 to 70 reps per muscle group per session. Now, I'm citing this recommendation from Eric Helms, and it's based on a whole bunch of research, but particularly on a systematic review by Wernbaum that was attempting to find a sweet spot in the dose-response relationship between volume, intensity, frequency, and muscle growth. I would caution you to be aware of crossover on lifts, like the bench press, which trains more than just chest. And remember that while volume will need to go up incrementally over the course of your training age, that doesn't mean that you need to increase it every single session or every single week. See, that's just the kind of brash, reckless attitude that Garrosh Hellscream had, and why, as far as I'm concerned, Thrall will always remain the true War Chief of the Horde. Alright, go back to looking at my Paladin now. Actually, wait a minute. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. Wait a minute, hold on, damn it.